Hello everyone. Today we're going to talk about the 10 best story-driven horror games worth playing in 2026, and not only in that year. I'll throw in a disclaimer right away, so don't skip it. What you should know before you start watching is that this is not a selection of games made in Unity by a schoolboy on his knee, and with 3 reviews on Steam. All of the games are quite well known, and even cult classics, but these are the games you should play if you want to immerse yourself in this genre. Also, this is my first video, so please don't judge too harshly. I think I've said everything I need to say, so enjoy watching. So it's definitely worth starting with the real basics, and in many ways, the most obvious choice, the remakes of the old Resident Evil games. Currently, there are remakes of the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th games, and I recommend checking out these 3 games. I won't lie, I enjoyed playing all 3 games, but personally, I found the 2nd one to be the most atmospheric. It's basically the gold standard for many remakes. The remake of the 3rd part turned out to be not bad, but somewhat controversial because first of all, the game itself is short, and secondly, a couple of cult and difficult puzzles from the original 3rd part were cut out. And on top of that, the game was sold at the same price as the remake of the 2nd part, while significantly inferior to it in terms of content. Don't think that I'm sitting here being all businesslike and throwing stones at this game, because I liked it. I just pointed out the obvious flaws that fans criticized it for, nothing more, because it's worth playing regardless of what others think about it, since personal emotions are always more important when playing a game. As for the remake of the 4th game, it is of a very high quality, not much inferior to the remake of the 2nd game. The game is outrageously good, and I've played it at least twice without ever regretting it, because everything that made us love the original is here, not only in terms of the story, but also in terms of gameplay, because the 4th game stood out greatly from the previous, more mundane parts, so to speak. And visually, all 3 remakes not only look very expensive and rich, but all 3 are also optimized in a human way. So you can play even on budget hardware with good graphics and frame rate. In general, if for some reason you missed the original games and don't want to dive into old projects, I recommend playing the remakes. And this is The Evil Within 2, and yes, a game that I myself have only recently become familiar with. Overall, in this 2-part series, it just so happened that both parts are loved more or less equally, even though they are quite different. The first one was darker, harsher, and bloodier, while the second one, in my opinion, is more meaningful, but still damn scary. That said, you need to go into the 2nd part with a thorough understanding of what happened in the first, at least in my opinion. Perhaps the main difference between the 2nd and 1st games is the semi-open locations. The game no longer forces you to follow a strict path, instead giving you small areas of the city where you can decide for yourself whether to follow the plot strictly or explore different corners and find side quests that expand the lore and main story. Some people didn't like this, but I did, because each time it's a kind of test, especially considering that there are few bullets, and you want to stick your curious nose in and learn something new. And in terms of the story, it's no longer a creepy horror reminiscent of Japanese horror films. This time, the plot is more personal for the main character, perfectly playing on feelings of guilt and loss. I won't spoil it, but those who have played it will understand perfectly. And even though the 2nd part may not scare you as often as the 1st part did, doesn't need to. It has a completely different approach that works perfectly for overall immersion. If you're not familiar with this game duology, you should definitely fix that, especially since Shinji Mikami, the man who worked on the original Resident Evil games, is the father of these games. Next up is The Quarry, a stunning interactive horror game from the same creators who brought us the magnificent Until Dawn, which we will also discuss, as well as the Dark Pictures Anthology series. Unfortunately, this is the last good game from this studio at the moment, because in 2024, they released a disgusting game about a maniac in an old factory, which is worse than their previous games in every way. And it is The Quarry that, in my opinion, is closest to Until Dawn, released in 2015. After all, the game is also made with a great love for teen horror movies from the 2000s, although some call it trash horror, but to each his own, so to speak. According to the plot, the game takes place at a summer camp, where a group of counselors decide to stay for another day after all the kids have left, And spoiler alert, it was their worst decision ever, because some crazy stuff starts happening, and the main task is to survive. Yes, everything I said above sounds like the plot of the most banal horror movie, and the game doesn't even try to hide it. On the contrary, it revels in cliches and deliberately juggles them. Moreover, the story turned out to be very coherent. It takes its time and develops events smoothly, and the plot, which seemed default at first, ends up having many more twists and turns as the game progresses. I would also like to praise not only the graphics, because in this regard it is a full-fledged movie on the screen, but also the amazing voice acting. The voice actors here did a great job, 100% for sure. The voice actor did a particularly good job with Dylan's voice. Those who have played the game will understand me perfectly. And then there's a work called the Blair Witch Project. I don't know about the books, but in the late 90s, 2 films were released on this topic, and in the early 2000s, even a couple of games. But as a rule, these were quest games and did not gain much popularity. Then in 2016, a 3rd film was released, but I don't think many people heard about it either. And now in 2019, the developers from Bloober Team have released a game that, in my opinion, turned out to be awesome, although not very well known, but definitely worth checking out. In short, the plot is set in 1996, and there is a cursed forest where a little boy disappears. A group of police officers and our main character, a former cop, join the search operation, accompanied by his faithful dog. If anything, to understand the plot, I recommend that you watch the first film, because the game continues its story so that you can better understand what it's all about. Yes, in fact, it seems that the plot is as down-to-earth as possible, almost mundane, but the deeper you go into the forest, the more you begin to understand that there is no easy way back. Moreover, as you progress through the game, the forest itself is constantly changing. The paths may lead you completely astray, the compass also behaves strangely, and familiar places suddenly look different. And at some point, you catch yourself thinking that you are no longer oriented, not only in space, but also in what is happening in general. Yes, in terms of gameplay, it's a typical first-person exploration game, but it's so atmospheric, especially when playing with headphones, as the sounds and rustles in the forest are implemented incredibly well. It's important to understand that this game is not about screamers and witches, but rather a horror game about anxiety, loss of orientation, and the fear of being left alone with your own thoughts. Next up is Visage, which totally freaked me out back in the day, and not without reason. Visage is literally the spiritual successor to Kojima's PT video game demo, only it's been brought to completion. Although, when you think about it, it's just a typical horror game with a gloomy mansion and gameplay that is referred to as a walking simulator, which is another common detail with Kojima's latest games. However, the ordinariness of the game is precisely what makes it so immersive. It's a typical 2-story house that you could see in any other horror movie. But what's scary here is not so much the presence of screamers as the constant feeling of anxiety, the feeling that something has gone wrong in a completely familiar space. Simply put, as in the case of the aforementioned Blair Witch, the mansion will change as you progress through the game and try to confuse you. At the same time, the story's not served on a silver platter. There is not even a clear goal in the game, such as go there and do this. The whole puzzle of what is happening has to be pieced together from fragments, details, dialogues, and strange events that begin to occur around you, and they happen very carefully. The game does not rush to scare you. It first breaks your sense of security. The lights may go out on their own, the door may slam shut, the radio may suddenly start playing, and you stand there wondering if it was real or not. The sanity system deserves a special mention. The longer you are in darkness and uncertainty, the more the game begins to mock you. And it's not always obvious whether you're really in danger or if it's just another trick of perception, similar to what happened in the Amnesia series, which only benefits the game. If you're looking for a truly dark, psychological horror game, Visage is the game that will scare you in a way that is definitely not childish. Still Wakes the Deep is another walking simulator game in terms of gameplay, but it's a game that's very good in terms of story and atmosphere. In my opinion, it's one of the most underrated horror games I've ever played, which I ran through in one sitting when it was released. But let's take it one step at a time. The plot tells the story of a very ordinary working man whose personal life is not going well, and he goes on a shift, basically to work as an electrician on an oil rig in the middle of the cold sea. However, he doesn't work there for long, and after a short time, the hero is fired for fighting. It seems like the story is over, so he packs his things, jumps into a helicopter, and flies home. But then the oil rig hits something unknown, which causes a terrible nightmare to begin. What makes the game scary is that you don't understand what's going on at all, and this feeling of total uncertainty about what's happening weighs heavily on you as you play. There are tons of games based on the works of Howard Lovecraft, but very few of them are any good, and this is one of those rare examples where the game turned out to be excellent. Plus, the main character is an ordinary worker, not a soldier or a special agent. So Still Wakes the Deep immediately makes it clear that survival here is not a question of strength, but a question of how long you can keep running and climbing. The feeling of constant tension never leaves you for a minute, because sometimes just when it seems that things have quieted down, something is bound to happen. It doesn't have to be a monster. Sometimes a sound, a vibration, or a sudden stop of a mechanism is enough to bring the tension back, and this technique works perfectly. The third part of Dead Space, according to fans and gamers in general, is the worst game in the series, which in many ways destroyed it. Personally, I admit that the game turned out to be weaker than the first two parts, but I would definitely not call it a killer and trash in the series. And yes, I understand perfectly well why it was criticized, but at the same time, I think it's unfair to completely write it off. Let's start with the main thing. Dead Space 3 is no longer pure horror, as the first two parts were. The game has noticeably shifted towards action, added co-op, increased the scale, and stopped putting so much pressure on the player. But despite all this, the atmosphere hasn't completely disappeared. It's just changed, and the very co-op that many believe killed the series actually fits in perfectly here. And I'll even go so far as to say that it perfectly complements the original story that you'll experience in single-player mode. Plus, the story becomes more global. In the first and second parts, it was the personal story of Isaac and his nightmares related to Nicole. But here the developers are trying to tell more about the lore of the game itself and where the necromorphs came from in the first place. In terms of gameplay, Dead Space 3 has indeed become easier and more dynamic. There are more ammo, more enemies, and a faster pace. But at the same time, the game has introduced one of the most interesting mechanics in the series: weapon customization. The ability to assemble your own guns really added variety and made each build unique. Yes, Dead Space 3 is not the gold standard of horror. Yes, it is inferior to the first and second parts in terms of tension, but I still think it's worth playing, firstly to form your own opinion and get your own emotions during the game, and secondly, if you've played the first and second parts, it's worth finishing the story and, as they say, putting the gestalt in place. But in the Silent Hill series, there's an interesting situation. Some people worship the original and consider it a masterpiece. Others give it a thumbs down. And the third part of the series feels like it's neither here nor there. Although I think it turned out to be interesting and definitely worth your attention. For me personally, the main highlight of the third game is the main character, Heather, who is probably the most vivid protagonist in the entire series. She is not overly silent like the character in the first game and is much more emotional than James. She is a living person who reacts to what is happening, gets angry, gets scared, resists, and it is through her that the game feels even heavier. In addition to all the emotions described above, there are stunning facial animations. To give you an idea, Silent Hill 3 was released in 2003, but in my opinion, it was clearly ahead of its time in terms of graphics, lighting, and character facial design. At the same time, the plot directly continues the events of the first part, but does not require perfect knowledge of the lore. The story about a cult, destiny, and an attempt to break free from an imposed role is presented gradually without unnecessary explanations, forcing you to think for yourself and analyze what is happening. Plus, the symbolism inherent in the series is still there, both in the design of locations and enemies. There is more physical horror, more disgust, and far fewer attempts to be beautiful. Everything around looks sick, and this feeling does not let go until the very end. The only but is that not everyone will dare to play such old horror games because of the controls. For many, these games will seem clunky, with awkward combat and so on. However, Silent Hill is not a series of games that people love for its gameplay. It is a series of games that people adore for its interesting plot, which fans continue to dissect piece by piece to this day, discovering something new. I'm sure you've all heard of the Silent Hill, Resident Evil, and Dead Space series, so I suggest adding something similar but less well-known, such as the obscure duology. This survival horror series, forgotten by many, had its first installment released in 2004 and the second in 2007. I personally recommend playing both parts, although many consider the second to be weaker than the first, but not so bad that it's terrible. In terms of plot, the story in both parts seems like another teenage horror story. School, nighttime, missing students, and all kinds of monsters, which gives the impression of a low-budget trash horror movie from the 2000s, but Obscure quickly breaks this impression as you play through it. The main feature of both parts is team control, where you play not for one hero, but for a group of teenagers, each with their own characteristics, weaknesses, and even unique abilities. And if a character dies, they die forever, and that's when the game starts to get really tense. Because you become attached to the characters, you start to protect them, distribute resources, and think ahead. The first part captivated with its atmosphere of uncertainty, while the second has become more global, with events going beyond the school, more monsters, a darker story, and higher stakes. By the way, it's worth noting that both parts can be played in co-op, and miraculously, at that time, it didn't particularly bother anyone or break the atmosphere of horror. Yes, technically, both parts are outdated. Yes, the controls can be annoying and the animations look awkward. But all of that ceases to matter when the game starts to play on your emotions, which it does perfectly. It's still a shame that the second part was the end of the series. In my opinion, it had great potential, but unfortunately, after the 2008 game Alone in the Dark, no other interesting projects followed from this studio. Cry of Fear is another game that doesn't look like something expensive, cinematic, and wildly rich. In fact, Cry of Fear's visuals alone may scare many players away, especially modern ones, but that would be a mistake. By the way, the game was originally a mod for Half-Life 2, but then it grew into a full-fledged single-player game. And what's funny is that it's completely free on Steam, which I can't understand at all, because the game is awesome and worth paying money for, but, well, the story in Cry of Fear is primarily about an ordinary Swedish boy named Simon, who wakes up in an empty Stockholm after an accident, and then the whole trip begins. All kinds of nightmarish creatures, a distorted city, hallucinations, and the feeling that reality is about to break down completely. I won't spoil it, but the story here is as personal as it gets, about depression, loneliness, and inner demons, which is why it's so beloved. As for the gameplay, it's a quirky first-person survival horror game where you run through dark streets and apartments, solve puzzles, fight monsters with limited ammunition, all accompanied by gorgeous sound design, rustles, breathing, and sudden noises. Although the game looks low budget, in terms of atmosphere, it is on par with such hits as Silent Hill or Amnesia, and in some ways even better. I am green with envy for those who are not yet familiar with this creation, and I strongly recommend that you remedy this as soon as possible.